Some people went to had this extra super sized glass of beer, and everybody was having beer out of this super glass. I don't know, probably there's something there in that place and it is worth going back. What was the name of the pub or some of you went to last night? Anybody remembers? No. Probably you had too much beer. Anyway, I'm here today. First of all, let me just say who I am. I'm Dina Tagari and I come from Cyprus. I work at the University of Cyprus there, but I'm not here to introduce myself. I'm here to introduce Professor Elana Shohamy, a friend, and a great motivator for me, and he gave me a lot of inspiration during my own PhD. I quoted her a lot. Anyway, I'm going to read what I prepared for her, and then I'm going to give Elana the floor, because Elana is much bigger than I prepared in my 3 paragraphs. Elana Shohamy. Elana Shohamy is a professor of language education at the School of Education, Tel Aviv University, where she researches topics on multilingualism within the context of critical framework, language rights, and coexistence. Her work in language testing focuses on the power and misuses of tests in education and society, and more recently on multilingual testing. The work in language policy addresses mechanisms used for creating de facto policies that penalize immigrants and minority groups. In the past decade, Elana researched ample dimensions of linguistic landscape, referring to languages displayed in public places with a focus on language landscape as arenas of conflict and contestation. Her books include The Languages of Israel, Policy, Ideology, and Practice, with Burnham Spolsky, 1999, The Power of Tests, A Critical Perspective of the Uses of Language Tests, in 2001, Language Policy, Hidden Agendas and New Approaches, in 2006, Linguistic Landscape, Expanding the Scenery, with Dirk Burter, 2009, and Linguistic Landscape in the City, with Ben Raphael and Barney, 2010. Elana is the editor of the journal Language Policy and the winner of the 2010 Lifetime Achievement Award granted by the International Language Association in Cambridge, UK. Elana is a lot more things, but I'd like to give her the floor now because and so probably you are looking for a very interesting presentation. Elana, may I welcome you to the podium?
With different interests in many areas that I find in common and enjoyed it tremendously. It's my first ELF conference, and probably not the last. So I hope to come again, and we will enjoy very much the stay here so far. So what I talk about is the language testing for special requests. Because what I do in this work, I don't know, some of you may have read my earlier work on critical language testing. And in critical language testing, what we do basically is we ask questions about tests. We ask lots of questions about tests and without tests. It's not, I don't come from a point of a believer, but somehow in this era where we're trying to do a big change, as the paradigm has changed and we're thinking differently about what language is. Somehow, me, who's been so opposed to tests and critical of tests, I kind of think that if we don't change the tests, nothing will happen. Because tests, in spite of them being so powerful, or because of that, actually, tests, I think, are so crucial, and it was mentioned a number of times. You mentioned textbook and tests yesterday. So I think those things are almost essential because tests have kind of life of their own, and they work in a certain direction, and people who do the tests are not necessarily us. We can think differently about language today than we do, but people who do the tests may oppose us, and they have this tool called tests or textbooks or anything else of this nature, and they can manipulate the society any way they want. And the point that I'm always saying, they are not just manipulating society, but they're manipulating our knowledge. So in spite of the fact that we could say, yeah, ELF exists, and there's so many studies in this group, and others who work on ELF and try to understand what it really brings and what it does. And it's obviously different than what we've been talking about language before, and Henry said it yesterday in his talk too. So how is this connection to reality, which is schools, education, students, entrance to higher education, moving to a new country, like the citizenship tests are so big now around the world, especially in Europe. So how do we work with the two? And my point has always been, if we don't change the test in this situation, we will not deliver. So we will go on talking to ourselves, which would be nice, but how do we really, yeah, very nice, yeah, eat, drink, you know. But the question is whether we can expand it beyond that point to make it more of a society norm. And it's not the first time that the changes are being introduced. If we think of the older days of the grammar translation and structuralism and many other methods of the past, these have changed when Henry and people of your era mostly, and we're all in the same era, but probably a decade difference that made a difference in terms of what language is about. Because when I studied in school, at university, communicative competence was just coming in. And I think these issues, and we changed drastically. Not all, of course, but things. We know if we look at the history of applied linguistics, that changes have been happening. So how is it that we talk, let's say, in AAAL and about translanguaging, no, we don't see any of the tests that teach it. So we are shifting paradigms on one hand, but it's not enough to be thinkers or researchers without trying to change. And things have changed. I mean, Bernard Sportsky years ago wrote about the different eras of language testing, which always followed the changes that were taking place in language, in what language is. So usually it happens, but I have the feeling that somehow, because there are testing organizations which are often, like we have the group for many years, Language Testing Research Colloquium, which is a group on its own. I go to that conferences. We never ever talk about what is language, never. It's all about techniques. It's about how to do it in the most efficient way, how to do it with a computer versus non-computer, how to do it in a shorter time so the testing companies can make more money. So it's like all these things that happen, but nobody ever talks about what is language. And of course, critical language testing, although they gave me this nice award a few years ago, it's not really something that really deep inside I think people believe in. It's kind of nice to show that we are ethical and everything, but basically I think we are missing a big part of not talking about it. I think what's happening today, there are many testing groups, organizations, conferences, which rarely, if ever, deal with the meaning of language. And the big question I'm asking here, we should all ask, is how can we make the connection? And before I start my talk, I will, the official talk, whatever it's called, when we do a PowerPoint. I wish we didn't have to use it. I don't know who invented it, because we are all in it, you see. But somehow, we're all captive of this thing, right? So before I start that, I want to give you like 2 examples. Whatever I say today, at least I want to cover these 2 examples. And one is an example where I work with principals. This is the people who have to do those changes. And this is I'm sure everything I said, some of you heard me in different contexts because I go to many conferences. So I repeat myself on something, so forgive me if some of you have heard. But I work with a course for principals for 6 years in a row. It's prospective per principal, very prestigious program. And they select the top of students, and they will be the next leader of the future. So a few years ago, they asked me to teach a course on language policy. Now, if you only knew the ignorance of principals, headmasters, whatever they're called here, about language, you'd be shocked. They know nothing. For them, language is what they learn in high school about grammar, conjugations, about correct language or not correct language in terms of very old views, but nothing of multilingualism. First time they hear the word. So my task, which I think is the most important course I teach, And I've been teaching them for a whole year, actually, semester or sometimes a year, about language policy, because the principal has to make all those decisions. I don't know if we have any principals in this audience, but oftentimes we don't see those people. We only see it when our kids go to school and then they come home amazed after they don't know anything about what we are doing. But this is the truth. So this course is to teach them about language acquisition, about language policy, about, as a principal, what do I teach? You know, do I teach, what languages do I introduce? Sorry. Do I introduce English and at what age? What do I do with Arabic, which is taught in Israel? What do I do with the immigrants? We have like a third of the students are immigrants. They know nothing about policy. Native, non-native, for them it's obvious. It's always the native. It's not even a question when you tell them that, no, so, but you mean the non-native knows English too? I mean, it's kind of, it's like something, it's unbelievable. And many times I give those questionnaires at the beginning of the semester to those principals, and I ask them what they know about language. And of course, very little. So what I try to do is to give them this kind of information to teach with them. And an example I mentioned to you the other day is that, but how can they relate to language when they themselves are monolingual and perhaps know English as well? So one of the things they ask to do, they have to go and interview people who are close to them. Often it's their parents who learn the language, so they have to interview those people who have switched languages once or twice in their lives. Their grandparents, for example, I just gave a talk about it in Australia, about this whole thing, and I showed them quotes about those principal things. I don't want to put too much time on that. So the idea is really to give them opportunities to find out what it means. So the grandparents don't even know how to read and write Hebrew, although they've been in Israel for 50 years. Oh, you don't know how to read and write, so how did you survive? And they tell them about how they survived and how difficult it was and how victimized they were not knowing the language of the land, or whatever language needs to be learned. Or other people who had to learn, or even sometimes the mother of one of us that said she has the notebooks from when she moved, she immigrated to Israel, and she had those notebooks in the attic of their house. And there she pulled down the notebook because nobody ever asked her this question about how she learned Hebrew. She's constantly hiding it, that she spoke Dutch before she moved to Israel. So there is, she even hides her accent, she even tries, just to show that she's very much part of the nation. So this is the kind of, and the experience of interviewing others, or even thinking about yourselves as learning a language, learning English, most of them. But mostly I talk to them about learning, but other close people to them. So they have totally different sympathy. And one student, her mother is deaf, and she had to interview the mother about what it meant for her to learn Hebrew, deaf language, sign language. So sign language in Hebrew, and she only spoke French sign language. She came from Tunis or from France. And we have a tape of an hour and a half where the mother describes in signs, and the student interprets for the audience what it meant for her to learn a new sign language at a certain time. And of course, nobody was tolerant. So this is one example. And the other example is what I'll be mentioning here, but which mostly my work is a linguistic landscape now. And a lot of the things what we ask the students to do is go around and look at languages in the public space. This is the first assignment in the first week. They come back, they're shocked how multilingual Israel is. Everybody's talking about Hebrew, but you see it's so hidden in many places. And they come back to school after a week, after they documented, they all have to document like 30 signs like this, come back, reach conclusions about it, and they talk about it, and they share, and they're shocked. So I think for principals, it's not enough to just give them a talk like this, but basically to have them experience multilingualism. So this is just one example, working with principals in terms of spreading the word. So I think this is the principles, I'm not saying the principals are the only ones, but I think in the total, if you look at the total things, the principals are very, very important group that we have to create this change we were talking about yesterday. Okay, so now to the official. Basically what we're talking about with critical language testing, just for those of you who don't know what it is, and I'll just say what do we do then, and I can share the PowerPoint with you, and You're welcome to send it to everybody. So basically, we could ask questions about tests. We challenge the enormous power of tests. We examine their impact, their cost, their ethicality, equality, justice, for people who don't do well on tests. You know, why is it? They really don't know, or the material is too difficult, or just they never think of the non-natives, for example. Engages in changes, activism, advocacy. Enormous responsibility of testers, us working in language testing, and users who design and adapt tests. So, examples of questions we ask. Do language tests reflect the most updated and current views of what it means to know a language? And this is so appropriate. I chose especially questions that are appropriate for here, which is like, is that reflected, is ELF even represented there? To know a language in a plurilingual society, ELF, translanguaging, bi-multilingualism, do tests reflect those? No, I can tell you they don't. Do we set realistic goals in terms of the levels of proficiency, dynamic and fluid nature of language? Even the idea of a native speaker, can anybody become a native speaker? Very few of us can even sound like native speakers. I was born I was speaking English until I was 5. My parents are from America. I was born in the US until the age of 5 when I moved to Israel. I spoke English only. I totally speak ELF. How is it? What happened? You know? So I think these kind of things are really important. We all use, many of us use this language, and the question is, do the test, we have even realistic goals. Whatever I do, years ago I wanted to sound like the native. Now I don't even want it, because I don't want to sound like that at all, you know? So, but again, it's all a question of attitude changes, right? I think this is what we're trying to do. And I gave the example to somebody the other day, some of my Arab students in Israel, they try to sound like Israelis, native, Jewish natives. They try so hard. And I gave an example to somebody, I was sharing it, I think, with Nikos the other night, and then I was saying, like, and the whole semester she's considered, you know, Jewish Israeli because she's dressed, you know, jeans, you know, like everybody else, not covered. And then at one point somebody heard her say an R, which sounds like Arabic. And somebody in class, a Jewish student, what? You're an Arab? No. Are you sure you're an Arab? You know, no, not possible. Somebody once said to her, maybe you're a Yemenite. Yemenite are the Jews. Maybe you're a Yemenite Arab, but you can't be really. And like almost the whole change of attitude that so it is instead of like R can make a huge difference in terms of, and people live with this crime, you know, for years and trying to hide it. So this is just one example. So we set realistic goals. Can anybody even be there when we say native speakers? Is it realistic or not? Okay. Is it appropriate to use native speaker as the goal? This is the same issue and criteria. Is it ethical to design tests based on definition and goal provided by central agencies? We didn't invent the native speaker. Somebody told us, the I want in your class, your school should reach such level, the highest level of CFR. Is ethical based on test definition and goals provided by central, we have various agendas for introducing tests. I always, for me, it's very interesting because I come from a nation that nobody spoke the language, nobody spoke Hebrew. It was imposed on everybody. And I did a number of papers on the victimization of Hebrew. When you force on everybody who came to Israel to speak a language they never spoke. Some men could read it, but women never. My grandmother died at the age of 82 without knowing anything in Hebrew. And for years that she was the wife of the mayor, which was even worse. So he would never walk with her in the streets because he had not acquired Hebrew. And she didn't. And it was an embarrassment to speak Yiddish. We're talking about a Jewish language. It's awful. But she lived like that. So the whole idea that somebody said, this nation should all acquire Hebrew. Did they even check whether it's possible, or feasible, or whatever? Okay. So do tests include all the components that contribute to performance of tests beyond language per se? It's not just about language, it's about performance, ability to use language, ability to be interviewed, or whatever it is. Is it fair to compare language proficiency of second language learners to those of natives? I think it's not fair. I think it's two different channels, but we'll get to it in a minute. Are second language learners capable of acquiring native? Capable? What we see with immigrants, adult immigrants like my grandmother, it's not possible. She can go to all the schools, she'll never learn it. She's too old to do it. She's busy, she has kids, grandchildren, or whatever. Our second language learner, okay. Do language tests reflect the length of time it takes to acquire a second language? It's another thing, and I'll show you something about that. So let me talk a little bit about tests. And there's a few things about tests which are important here to change. When we talk about tests, we talk first about the most important thing is what we call the trait. Trait and method. Trait means mostly, what are we testing? This is the point I mentioned at the beginning. If else is what we believe in now, or think this is the right thing, else needs to be tested. The language, the criteria has to be else. If it was grammar in the old days, so grammar was the thing that was tested. If it was grammar translation, so to be able to translate was the thing that had been tested. So this is the what. And I think the what is the most important thing, and I mentioned it before, how language testers in their conferences rarely, if at all, talk about what the what is. So the what is, I think, the crux. Method, how to test. Language testers have been very busy with how to test, techniques. Impact of test. This is something I and other people who work in critical testing introduced, which is no test is good if you don't check what it does to people, if it discriminates people, if it makes certain people have to be expelled back to their home country just because they don't know German or whatever. This is a problem of tests. And we work a lot today about consequences. And the stakeholders, these are the principals. These are the ones who make a decision to adapt certain tests. When we have to reach them, it's very, very important. So we talk about the what, the how, the impact, and the stakeholder. And as an example, the what, like ELF is a what, multilingualism or translanguage is a what, non-native variety is a what, the how, techniques, how to do it, I mentioned it. Impact, let's see, what does the test do well and what doesn't, the consequences. And the stakeholders can be all the people I mentioned to you here. Okay? So, major advances in language testing and assessment have been mostly on the how. I already mentioned it. Statistics, data analysis, scores, ranking, typical paper in language testing research colloquium. Only limited advances have been on the what. What are we testing? The content. English, Lingua, Franca, ELF, translanguage, environment, whatever we call it, and I'll mention it in a minute, challenge the traditional language assessment construct, no question. Testers are expected to address new definitions of language and the diverse situations of language learning and use. And, okay, let's take it in a minute. The what needs to be expanded and changed. Okay, current views of language. And here I'm going to just repeat things which you know already. Features, language is dynamic, energetic. I just want to show that we think so differently about language today. Open, no fixed boundaries, we move from one language to another, resulting in hybrids, fusion, non-native varieties, and so on. It's negotiated, interacted, mediated in an attempt to make meaning. It is manifested beyond words via multimodal forms. I told you, a lot in linguistic landscape, and the paper I gave a few weeks ago in Brisbane was about, let's expand language, let's include the space, what the language is in the space, and what it means to know a language. And I'm working on this kind of area now to develop broader views of what language is and to include the space, the ecology, the language and ecology. And it's fantastic here to walk around Athens and to see, the Greek and the English and in so many different combinations, but many languages presented in the public space, let alone graffiti in our area, which is fascinating. It is negotiated, interacted, mediated. We know all these things, nothing new. You know better than I do about these things. It is manifested beyond words, via multimodal forms of images, signs, music, language. It's not just language words, we know that. And food and other ways of languaging. For most people in the world, acquiring L2 is viewed as ELF, multilingual and multimodal. A number of languages, codes, dialects, and modalities exist harmoniously. It's not to be separated. We speak in one, read in another, discuss in the third, and often code switch. Now, I always give the example of my mother, who died last February at the age of 97. And all of her life, she functioned in 3 languages. Yiddish, which she spoke when she was a child, Hebrew, which she was forced to learn, and English, which she used in the US before coming to Israel. And everything was in 3 languages. Not so much the speech as much as the comprehension. She would know certain things in one language and she could, oh, how do you say it in Yiddish? What do you mean? How do you say it in English? So the idea of the languages don't leave you. Although people want us to forget the old language, but basically they stay with us, and I mentioned something about that. We speak in one, read in another, and constantly culture. That doesn't mean everybody does it, but it's a phenomenon that exists. Language is not limited to what people say, but also to how they choose to represent language, what is available in the ecology, in the public space, via science, and what I already mentioned. But for me, very important is language is personal. When I call somebody, somebody right away says, oh, Elana, how do you know it's me? I mean, wait, oh, because you have a certain accent, or not have, whatever you call it, or try to ignore it, and you speak a certain voice, and a certain intonation, and a certain rhythm, and choice of words, they know it's me. So we each are individuals, and we have our language, like our faces, and everything else. All of these results in new and creative mixes of accent, words, tones, and you can read the rest. Okay, this is one example. This is one person. I'm just showing you a few examples to make the PowerPoint a bit more lively. This is like a store in Nazareth, and the person just decides to gastronome, like a grocery store on tap. And the point is really, this is him. He wants, if there's an agenda that he may not speak the language, but he wants Russian customers to show up. It may be for many, many reasons. Oftentimes, I don't know, you know what kosher is like. So oftentimes we say, if you put this, it means we also sell non-kosher food, which the Russians usually eat, you know, kind of thing within Israel, we're not allowed or whatever. Everything in Israel requires 2 hours explanation. Especially in English, new Englishes are constantly being created, resulting in ELF, hybrid, and all the things I already said. Okay, so this is where I see it now. This is one example I've seen some of you, and basically the person has to write a note, how to do chocolate recipe, and he says that take the water and put in the ke'ara. It is the then take the chocolate and put in the ke'ara too. Then they take the sugar and put in the shofech in the ke'ara. Basically, it's a total hybrid of Hebrew and English. Totally understandable. You'll get the best chocolate chip cookies if you follow this. Okay. Another example, transliteration. What is this? Is this English? What is it? Like Doshei Shoah. It's not a word in English. In Hebrew, it means something. It doesn't give you the translation, which means the street that is called the Holy People of the Holocaust. It's not that. Doshei Shoah, you don't know what it is, but it's another English. It's an English letter. You cannot deny it. Oh, sorry. Okay, on this one, the word Pepsi. It's nothing more. But how can we all know what it means, right? So I think one word says a lot sometimes, and obviously it will always be in English. Okay, then and you can see like different patterns of languages happening in space. I want to continue faster. By language is also political, and this is something we should not forget. And this is, if I think I work around social linguistics. And this is the main contribution of social linguistics, I would say. That those who go to the social linguistics symposium every year, we know, we look at language very differently. So language is political, let's not forget. Neymar group membership, exclusion, inclusion, loyalty, patriotism, economic status. Not to know Hebrew then was you're not patriotic. You don't like the land or whatever. Say, I don't want to, I want to only speak Russian. Forget it. What do you mean you're doing that? You won't be accepted to school, you won't get a job, you want that because of the language. Because the language indicates loyalty and caring. I want to be like them. I want to be like, should I speak Chinese or Taiwanese? Basically is, who do you want to be loyal to? Who is your real country? Or in Hong Kong, you go to the same thing. Okay, so also economic status, of course, and so on. I want to show you how political it is. This is an Israeli somewhere in an Arab town in the telecommunication. 2 Israeli flags. I mean, you know you're an Arab, and it's an Arab town, but the government decided to put 2 flags of Israel. You should know you are part of Israel, although you speak Arabic. And we put the sign in Hebrew. So you know exactly who is in charge. So there are all those messages, which I'm not going to go into it now, that these kind of things send, but to show that it's political. Or another place like this is Arabic in the middle, and you know that Arabic is because there is not because people wanted to put Arabic, no. It's because there's a Supreme Court decision in Israel that you have to put Arabic in all mixed towns where you have Arab and Jews living together. And this very week, as we talk, and just this is the last thing I did before I came here, we wrote a petition. I wrote by my own hand a petition because some right-wing members of the parliament decided they want to remove Arabic as an official language in Israel. While so far it's always survived. Like after the war and relationship with Arabs, you know, they want to remove it. So I, with a few colleagues, wrote a very nice petition. And we sent it to not to remove it, and now why do you want to speak in the two languages, having the two languages official, we can actually learn about it, so know the language and so on. Do I have time to what time? 9? Oh, 20 minutes. Okay, great. Maybe I have time for questions. So anyway, we got by last night, 7,500 people who signed the petition. And even the president of Israel said, no, we should not move Arabic as an official language. So these kind of things, you have to fight constantly about it. So just to show how political, and nothing to do with language, it has to do with we don't want Arabs. And what we say is like, what do you mean? On the contrary, we also political. Yeah, if you keep Arabic, hopefully we'll be able to get together much better, or maybe there will be peace one day, or whatever. Okay. This is something you could see that with Arabic there, somebody just ruins it, you know. No Arabs, no suicide. Okay, language falls basically in the midst of the battles of those seeking to maintain the order of the nation state and others attempting to change it. So I want to remind us always that language is also political. Okay, the combination of the nation state with the emergence of the freedom of individual resulting in defined and closed boundaries. And this is really the native speaker. Mother tongue, national languages, belonging, and so on. Okay, thus central authorities continue to view one correct language as a symbol of cohesion and unity and do not allow other language to smuggle in. So the reality, it's bound, it's anchored in politics. It's not just kind of, and I think you mentioned this too. Even English, which is L2 in most countries, a legitimate language, is still viewed as in homogeneous terms, the native speaker is rejecting code mixing or non-native varieties. And English in so many countries is viewed as a threat to the national language, right? And I want to say something about ELF and critical language testing. And given the enormous power of this, they are used by those in authority as being to impose ideological agendas such as monolingual practices in national languages. Look at the no challenge behind the US, the PISA, I'm sure you all know about the PISA, the citizenship test, we're all in not knowing the national languages. The Common Core in the US, it's all about knowing English, more and more. Language tests are high-stake encounters, continue to assess English as a native variety, and refuse to accept anything. The tests are monolingual, and so are the rating scales. And this is something, rating scales are kind of, you know, like the CFR, kind of an indirect way to get in testing. Because the CFR, you all know what the CFR is all monolingual, okay? Are based on homogeneous monolingual constructs. So when we attack tests with critical, we have to be critical on the CFR as well. And the CFR is very homogeneous and monolingual. And this is kind of goes silently. The CFR is currently a global tool used extensively in Asia, so okay, you know that, to define and categorize levels of language proficiency for most situations in most languages. Is known to affect teaching. We know CFR affects teaching, material, textbook, testing, especially. Accreditation systems and learning in and out of the classroom, a new accepted way to view language. So we were talking about ELF, and then you have the CFR, which is spreading bigger and bigger. And there's totally in contradiction, not that the CFR cannot change to make it more bilingual or ELFy, but still it is not. So when we do the fight, I mean, the battle, part of it is the CFR, is most important, I would say. And governments adopt the CFR. Mostly who is involved in the issue of governments. Goethe Institute helped us organize a conference in last May. It was a very good conference. But these places, all the British Council or places like this, or Cambridge, everybody holds the hands of the other, and they make money on that, and they introduce these kind of scales in a very kind of naive way. We give order to things, you know how much you know, A1, A2, B1, B2, and everything is kind of orderly, but it's very much different than what we are talking about here in ELF. Just a textbook, they claim to fit, match, link, the CFR, everything. This is the lingo today. I just met somebody the other day, and I asked him, what does this do? Somebody in the store, he said, I go to Germany. He said, oh, nice, what are you going to do German? I don't know, but I have to get to a C2. Now, why would anybody know what a C2 is? I happen to come from language, so I know, of course, but it's for those who are involved, the C2 is the item. Okay. I said the CFR so they can belong to the golden club. If you don't do the CFR now, you don't belong. European framework, it's good, forget it. It's not European. Not only. Okay, so I said more here about the CFR, and I don't want to, how appealing it is, I don't want to dwell on this more. I want to get to some other things. This is the mega tool and so on. I'm very critical of the CFR. Even the most beginner level, when the question will be posed, what is really meant by, you see anything which is anything here, this is at the lowest level, very big phrases and the satisfaction of needs of concrete type can introduce himself and other can ask. Okay, this is like in the lowest level where most of us are certainly not like native speakers, but look, nothing about you can do it in 2 languages, you can do it with hands, you can do it with a sign, you can do nothing of that. Okay? And if you go the higher level, it's even more subtle. You become the form of identity, like people don't let this one person say, I don't define myself as Jim, I'm a C2. So that's your new identity. There's a new article to show how when you are locked into a level, it's impossible to get out of it. There's a very interesting paper about how the testing identity. And the identity means I define myself and I believe this. And that's it. So it takes a long time, and not very many people are able even to move from one level to another. Okay, when 2 languages are assessed, this is done totally separation. Each language at a time with separate scores, and not in multilingual fluidity or translanguaging or ELF. The highest level is not the ELF. One is penalized for bringing in words from other languages. Let's say in speaking, how do we actually penalize in speaking? How do we use them? Mixed code. L1 accents, code switching in grammar. We do a lot of that all the time. I still don't build my sentences the way the native speaker does. Lexicon, word order, discourse, pragmatic, etc. So our language, our L1 or whatever it is, stays with us in speaking, for sure. Now, I speak in what? In writing, use of L1 syntax. I still, after years and years, have to give my papers to be edited. And I'm guilty of this as well because I'm an editor of the Journal Language Policy, and we still ask for good English, whatever it is. Vocabulary always requires editing, listening, contextualized within very state. Reading, comprehension requires additional knowledge beyond language, unique content, history, culture. Because many of the texts are not just language, it's much more. And this is why my mother kept using the 3 languages, the 3 rich sources she had. This is so in spite of the fact that immigrants and minority groups continue to use, rely on faith trust in their own life, ELF users rely and build on their L1. And there's lots of studies showing that, especially interpretation, content. This is most noticed in immersion programs. Okay, in Africa, where you see classes where they say teach all in English, when you go into class and it's Swahili and English. Everywhere. There's never not that. Okay? I don't ever remember a class that I went to that I visited that the teacher didn't use 2 languages in class, in an English class. Okay, the accommodations, I don't know if you know about accommodations, but these are, for immigrants, the way, we'll help you, we'll give you a translation for a few years until you know the language, and this is the famous picture that I'm sure for nothing else maybe you remember this one, this picture. And this is only just what they tried to do with us to forget our L1 for our immigrants, acquire the L2, make this weak eye, strong eye, so we'll be able to look just with one eye and not everything. I have a rich resource of languages. Why aren't you taking advantage of the whole repertoire. This is what we're talking about. So language learners continue to employ their L1 in all kinds of academic situations, often as a necessity. Ignoring L1 results in invalid tests and low performance of students on tests as they may never acquire it as native speakers. And this is the example, the examples I show, and we did it a few years ago, but it's a study that I have always with me, and this is how long it takes to learn languages, and what I show here. This is the group of Israeli natives. The blue one is the group of Ethiopian students who, for over up to 11 or 12 years, you see they always go lower than the average. And actually, these Ethiopians, even after 11 or 12 years, gets worse, but this is because of the sampling. And basically, it takes a long, it takes 9 to 10 years. The red is the Russian immigrants. It's a whole national sampling. And you see at the beginning, they're very low, they go up. After 9 to 10 years, they're able to do a little bit better in Hebrew. So it takes a long time. In the meantime, nobody gives them an ELF test, so nobody gives them something that their own language on. Now, this is the same thing with math. You see here again, the Ethiopians bad, all the way. The Russians are doing better. It takes them up to 9 to 10, 11 to 12 years to become even a bit better. And math is something they come to Israel with, because in Russia it's very important. And this is for all grades. We found similar, like grade 5, grade 9, grade 12, just 11. Okay, now, but what we showed, and this is something I'm working with that with now, we showed that if we give the same testing, the math test, in Hebrew and in Russian, in 2 languages, each question is translated into another language. So look what happens. They get a higher score, okay? All the way from 2 years. Every time the test is in 2 languages. So it shows you, and we have lots of studies that show that now. You give the test in 2 languages, I can, let's say the word butterfly in a math question. I don't know the word butterfly, papa, in Hebrew, but if I have it in Russian too, I can make sense of the question. So this doesn't happen with drills like 1 + 1, but it happens with problems, math problems. So your home language doesn't go away. And it helps you very much get higher scores. And it's pretty natural because it's important to show that you know math. Okay, and there's lots of other studies. Even Betsy, the bringer from here, wrote on mediation, which is again using your L1 with your L2, and so on. Okay, and there's ethnographic studies, which I'll mention in a minute. But I want to share some examples of what I call bilingual, multilingual tests, but you can think about it in terms of ELF2. Using academic text in 2 languages. Why not have the 2 languages? Like sometimes you have in prayer books, like, 2 languages, you have Hebrew and Arabic, or other languages, 2 pages, and you can give tests like that. Because the test is about content. It's not about whether you know the language, but knowing the language depends on whether you can answer the content. Writing in ELF, like the one, that person wrote the chocolate chip cookies in 2 languages. He was not encouraged to do it. He did it anyway because he had no choice. But in fact, if he would be encouraged to do it, he may get even a better text. Or worse, I don't know. Reading in L1 but processing in L2, this happens a lot. Discussing a text in 1 language orally based on a text in other language, that happens a lot. You read a text in 1 language, you talk about it, you discuss it, you interpret it in another language. Multilingual rubrics, rating scales as the CFR relating to different domains, and I've already played around a little bit with trying to change the CFR to a more open kind of construct. Group test consisting of role play using multiple languages, interpreting, translating, and so on. Interviewing cognitive work on language and content processing, and this is another work that's taking place at Center for Applied Linguistics now, where people are asked to do a math test. These are Hispanic kids speaking Spanish, and they're asked to do math tests, and they talk in pairs. And when they do it in pairs, you see they only speak about it in Spanish. But the answer they give is in English, but they get to the right answer. If they do it in English, forget it. They cannot, and working in pairs is very important. I've seen it many times where you work in pairs in your 5 minutes. If you get mediation in 2 languages, using one, okay. Question and challenge, maybe not so bad. What are the differences between ELF and translanguages and multilingual and multimodal? I mentioned this question in the symposium when we had in Brisbane. Actually, here in translanguage, I talk about L1 and L2, bilingual, multilingual test, and ELF. And what we need to figure out is where does it overlap, where it doesn't, what are we talking about the same thing or are we talking about something else? And I mentioned it to somebody yesterday, I think it was about translanguage. Said, no, translanguaging is not ELF. Okay, I think it was you, and then you said, no, it's not the same. ELF is not like translanguaging, right? Or who do I talk to? Not
I was in the group.
Translanguaging is not ELF. Okay, why is it different? I don't know. Okay, so I think we have to clarify these things. These are some of the challenges because I think we're doing lots of similar things. I'm not an expert in any of those, but I can see it from the outside, and I think there are lots of things which are very common. How are these manifested with regard to different competencies, different phases of language learning and use? You know, even in the conference, by the way, at Brisbane, Lingua was talking about Chinglish. This was the whole thing. So it's like mixing is so becoming such a variety now, especially with English. So where do we differ? Where does it differ and where is it the same? How do different L2 users utilize L1, L2, L3 production versus processing? How the two? Okay, how does it work differently? Different competencies, reading, writing, speaking. How is ELF manifested when students are encouraged to do it? Not when you're penalized for that. And are we talking here about Hebrew Lingua Franca, what I showed before? Is it even fair to use native as a criterion on test when Gallico claims that L1 and L2 learners have different brains? How can we use the ample research of ELF to create different assessment rubrics? There's so much research going on here. I think there's lots that can be used from this research to create different types of And the most important question for me is how can we convince the stakeholders, the language testing institution, teachers, parents, principals to adapt tests to these new constructs when the monolingual native variety is still so dominant and powerful. And this is, I think, the main question. But current tests serve the system. They're not based on how languages are used, but how they should be used. We're looking forward to the development of creative ways of applying ELF and other broader contextual traits that will include a full repertoire of individuals and group languages. These should be more ethical, create better impact, and will expand the understanding of real language in this day and age. Thank you very much.
I was just wondering if you might have an example of a type of test question that would show being informed by ELF. Just, see if we could see a practical, okay,
yeah,
this would be.
But I don't necessarily believe even that the test question is the appropriate way. This is one thing. I didn't mention here, this is probably the thing I told you I forgot to mention. Yeah, because I think we may think differently. This is the question you asked me in the first place. And I think we have to think differently about what it means to understand. What does it mean to use language? I mean, I think we have, so for example, the recipe is one example of a task. I think in terms of questions, I think what we did in the, with the Russian example, with 2 or 3 languages or whatever, one way, and it's very doable with the computer. It's very easy to do this translation. But in terms of breadth, I think the question is the rubric here. Because the question is, if you speak a language, and I don't give you your high level, you speak English like I do. I can give a talk, forward talk, So, but I was never far from that. So, for whatever reasons, I think these are the things we have to put out. And for me, the issue is also justice. This one Arab student I mentioned to you before is being penalized because of using the R, which is not like the Jewish R. How can you penalize her? This is like discrimination proper, And the same thing with English. Now, when English, of course, with English, it's more of a crime. I would say. I don't know, but more or less maybe. But I think it's really, but I think you can think of any task and decide how this goes. But I think even writing, encouraging people to write in ways which are healthy, whatever it's used. I mean, you know more than I, because you always been researching those topics. And even from what I heard in the past days, there are lots of studies, even the plenary that was given about immigrant languages. That's so appropriate here. But I think if we sit together and plan, if we have a committee or whatever group, and people start writing things like that, it's a good question to do it. But it doesn't have to do it, so they should have testing of the question. Because the question is not about the language, the question is about would I comprehend? Or whatever. Barbara. No, sorry.
Thanks very much. Just first a quick clarification. On an early slide, you had something that looked like it was equating ELF with non-native. And that actually contradicts some of the things you say later, because it doesn't. That would again treats people to one category. And looking at it from the function of ELF, of course, is across all 3 Equatorian circles. So of course, in many lands here, typical ELF situation, we have some so-called native and non-native speakers.
I agree with you. I
with ELF.
think it's kind of like the movement, and we should discriminate against.
Yeah, but it's also just a fact, functionally, that ELF works across all.
And ELF, I mean, you know better than I, of course I don't know, but how consistent is ELF? And I'm sure some of the things, it doesn't have to be consistent.
Exactly, and that goes to your language in question and everything.
Exactly.
And actually, also moving on from Jamie's question, I think there are things that we can now, I mean, it's taken about 10, 15 years, but we can now sit down, as you say, and think about this. And something that's not been said in the ELF literature, but not taken up very much in testing is, for instance, like thinking about a question, the importance of accommodation, which you had here. And there are ways of not penalizing people. You have these pair tests where you could actually give rewards to interlocutors who accommodate to the other person. Therefore, they switch into another language, use a wrong expression because the other person is using it, and give points for that. So
and paraphrasing, and the interaction itself right away. I mean, like, we have so many studies that and so many about communication, which is the way to communicate. How often we speak, like everybody here, you don't speak my ELF, I don't speak yours. It's like very different, but we learn how to accommodate so well. And this is why I also think the linguistic network should go into it. But I think I remember even your symposium in Beijing, I think. And the studies are there, they lend themselves to this kind of work now. But I think we are at the point that ELF, more or less, I should say, some people I know don't buy whatever. Mostly people who work in translation who look at language in a very close way. And I can think of some in my mind. But basically it's accepted. I mean, not only that you have a conference, you have a journal and so on. I think the idea is, for me, it's liberating. The minute that, for me, it's liberating, I speak okay, I mean, I'm fine, I'm good, kind of being a woman is fine, these kind of things. So I think the whole idea of liberating you, that's fine, but now I think we have to get the step to make it mainstream.
One more question.
Sure.
we're talking about traits and methods, and what worries me is that there might be a gap between these two. I mean, even if there's a change in perspective, what does it mean to know a language in terms of trait, even if decisions are given, when it comes to the question of how to test it, because testing, that word is creepy, so it's just framing it rather than a straitjacket. So when you're engaged or when you're making critical reflection on these two, does that worry as well? I mean, how to average?
It's not trait and method. It's not, God forbid, it's not a critical testing long term. It's the old traditional ways of thinking of tests.
Yeah, definitely.
You know that. So I think this is why the question of David, and this is a question about, give me an example of a question. Because we are kind of all very much think of that, and we should think of tasks or whatever. I think we have to think of different ways of looking at negotiations and communicating and creating and looking at the space, Because the space, you already get so much of the information about you get a lot of meaning, that's my point. So I think I agree with you, these terms are problematic and maybe there's something in between. But for me, it was very convenient to use this year to show that we forget to ask the question about what language. And I agree. Hope that the same question is addressed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elana. I was thinking that you were talking about principles and stakeholders and how important it is to influence policy on the part of micro-cognition also and test grading. But also within our own profession, one has to note that there is a persistent notion that exactly the kind of there is one language and only one language. If you look at the SLA literature, for example, if you look at the whole massive industry of task-based language teaching, the tasks are always defined in terms of success exactly in CEFR terms. So it's not just that outside our sort of academic field, the field of language, study of language and language learning and teaching, it's within it. And one begins to think, well, this is perhaps an impossible task, that there is something fundamentally institutionally constrained, which you simply, as an institution, if testing is an institution, and if the kind of mass production of approaches to teaching is institutional and commercial, how do you actually, instead of questioning the whole capitalist system, how do you actually doing that?
Some convert from Catholicism to another religion, or vice versa.
No, I'm capitalist.
Okay.
Capitalist. Well, I don't know anyone that's converted from capitalism. Maybe some, right?
This is what I okay. So it took me a second to understand you're talking about capitalism because you just explained it to me now. So in 2 minutes we communicate nothing, in 2 seconds we communicate and I know it now. So I only have to know that there have been changes over the years. Like alternative assessment, it's very big. You see, like portfolios, whatever, for the good or for the bad. I think we've done many changes over the years. I was captured 10 years ago, and I introduced this kind of different types of oral assessment. No, not possible, not possible. I think if we use the right tools and propaganda tools, something I am saying that we should use tests in order to make people accept, I think, now, in terms of our profession, this is why I keep going up to social linguistics. I stopped going not stop going, I go, but to countries that were SLA. I think the papers in SLA which we hear are very, very monolithical in their views, and I'm not there. So I think we all have to try to convince others rather than going in separate ways. I think we have to try to, these questions of modeling will not come up in social media. there's issues about immigrants and everything. Exactly, we heard yesterday. We see what's going on. We're not blind to what's happening and how people speak languages or use languages. And there's no way in the world in this global where we can ignore it. So the question is, where are our stakeholders? I agree, part of it is in the profession, whatever the profession is. Every few years we have this discussion, what is it like in research, right? So, what it is now. And so I think you're right. I mean, it's a broader task. But I think the fact that it comes from so many different ways, the translanguage, I think it's a strong point. The translanguaging, the bi-multilingual testing, or whatever, and the ELF is so popular, I think this shows something. But I think we, sitting here in this room, or other people, we have to take initiatives in showing examples, showing how it can be done, or whatever. And I worry less about people in our profession. Because I think academic professions now are all over the place. And are so crossing disciplines today. So maybe I have to go with economics. Maybe I have to go with ethnicity. And I don't know. It's not, I don't know what our profession is